back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. Today we're going to be speaking about human shields and Generation Z's perspectives on the use of human shields. Now, the use of human shields has been around for a very long time, and it's incredibly controversial. In fact, a number of legal theorists around the world argue that the use of human shields is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Today we're going to be looking at one particular operation involving human shields that took place towards the end of the Apartheid-Era in South Africa. Now, you probably know about Oliver Tambo, Govan Mbeki, Nelson Mandela, and other great black political leaders in South Africa and elsewhere who helped put an end to apartheid. What you may not know is about this operation that was called Africa Hinterland, that was part of MK, which was the military wing of the African National Congress, that used mostly white operatives on a day-to-day basis to run a safari operation that ran 40 safari trips. Now, they actually ran 40 trips, but while they were running the trips, they smuggled weapons into South Africa underneath the seats of the unsuspecting tourists who were on this safari. Now, when I finished working in South Africa, I took this safari, and I was one of the unsuspecting tourists, and I discovered this many years later. Today, we're going to be putting a spotlight on this operation and how Generation Z looks at it. First, we're going to hear from Misha Coleman. Misha was also a passenger on Africa Hinterland. She is now an associate professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Then we're going to hear from Ruth Mungai, who's a student at Duke University. Then we're going to hear from Isaac Willour, who's a student at Grove City College. And then we put together a panel at Durham University in the UK. Rachel Johnson, who's an assistant professor at Durham University, Imogen, Levine, Peter Firbank, and Neil Achary are all part of that panel. And finally, we're going to hear from Stuart Round. Stuart Round was one of the drivers of Africa Hinterland, and he's going to explain his perspectives on why he did what he did. And finally, just a word, if I may, before we get started, about writing in. We really urge you to please be as respectful as you possibly can when you write in. I understand this is an incredibly controversial topic, but we want to encourage students and we want to be respectful of students. It takes a lot of courage for a student to come onto a show like this and to talk publicly about such a controversial topic. So without any further ado, here is Africa Hinterland's former passenger, Misha Coleman from Australia.
A bit over 30 years ago now, I was living and working as a midwife in some of the black townships outside Cape Town, mostly Khayelitsha and Guguletu. We were delivering babies to women who couldn't afford to have them and who were returning to the most squalid conditions, and they often returned less than 6 hours after giving birth. I witnessed neck lacing and some of the most horrific acts of violence and injustice that I'm sure I'll ever see in my life. After delivering babies there for about a year, my partner and I looked for a trip. We wanted to see other parts of Southern Africa, and we came across Africa Hinterland, which was really the cheapest trip of its kind, but by miles at the time. I didn't know that we were essentially human shields. I was certainly motivated to be in South Africa by the injustices all around South Africa, but I had not put my hand up to be a human shield. I spent a little bit of time in a South African jail in Johannesburg, basically for being a white girl in a black area. And what I saw right in front of me just demonstrated that the authorities they completely operated with absolute impunity. And I have no doubt in my mind that if that Bedford van had been stopped and searched, and those rocket launchers and the other armaments, if they'd been found, we wouldn't have been given a trial. We wouldn't have had the opportunity to declare our naivety or ignorance. I have no doubt in my mind that we would have been summarily shot and killed. I understand why the tours continued to operate after Mr. Mandela was released and after the talks commenced. there was certainly no surety of any equitable outcome when those talks began. I do wonder what happened to all of those armaments, of which there must have been very many, and I am glad that none of us were found, and that the two operators weren't charged, because I have no doubt that we would have received no fair trial like everybody else in South Africa at the time.
The ethics of human shields have long been debated. I mean, the Geneva Conventions have taken up this issue. The Hague has taken up this issue. I think when you're looking at the ethics of supplying armaments to a force that's fighting for good, say rebels in, I don't know, South Africa or wherever they may be, you really have to think about this question of what is the cost of victory for that group, right? You have to think about, is it worth putting innocent civilians' lives in danger? How much danger? These are really weighty moral questions, because there always is that calculus of not only could something happen to the people involved, but you also have the calculus of how do you justify that to the rest of the world? Because in all of these operations, let's just assume that something goes wrong, because that's how these things tend to go. How do you justify that? What if the worst thing possible happens? How do you morally justify it? That's a really hard question. Yeah, I think it's beyond question that it's justifiable in certain instances, but not all, right? You have to be really, really careful about how much do you allow I don't like to call them the human shield, but how much does that person know? How blissfully unaware are they of what the true motive in that situation is? And furthermore, are they the kind of person whose identity, whose life could be put in jeopardy if that operation were to go wrong? So I think those are some really important preliminary moral questions to keep in mind.
And fair enough. And Ruth, what do you think about that? Do you agree with Isaac that those are some of the key issues that we might want to look at?
Absolutely. There's so much complexity and nuance in what was happening in that era. But then, from the lens and the perspective I'm coming from is justice, right? And especially when you're fighting on the defense, whenever you are, again, we're talking about people who are fighting against an unjust cause, you're limited in your options, say, versus in this case, it was the South African government at that time, right? And the level of engagement between those two parties are different. So while trying to fight for justice, there's also a desperation within there too that has to be factored in.
Yeah, I think there are all kinds of really necessary moral quandaries there when you're talking about asymmetric warfare, which is basically what, in the South African situation, is what that was. I mean, yeah, rebel groups are generally going to be operating with less mobility, less resources than the government they're fighting against. And when those rebels are fighting for causes related to human rights, well, what's the response there? How acceptable is it to leverage the power of outside agents, outside organizations to decrease the asymmetry there?
As a Quaker, I found it particularly difficult to kind of reason with the efficacy of effectively lying to a group of innocents and using them as a cover to bring weapons of death into a place that is already overcome with violence and weapons. And some of those weapons, while seized by the government and while handed over to the government after the apartheid struggle ended, some of those weapons will still be out there in South Africa, feeding into the violence in various townships, I imagine. And so as a Quaker who advocates for peace and non-violence above all else, I found that particularly difficult to reason with, especially when I consider that such an operation was probably instrumental in bringing an end to apartheid.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think there's some nuance there as to whether or not this was an ethical operation?
I think to say it was ethical would probably be wrong, but I think you do obviously have the complexity of you're taking weapons for the people who don't have the weapons and they're fighting against a governmental regime. And so there's a power imbalance there. And while I agree that, increasing violence isn't a positive thing to do, I think you do have to understand the nuance of the situation, which meant that, you needed to potentially try readdress that power imbalance. And I do think that bringing weapons in is a challenging thing to wrap your head around, particularly when you're looking at people who didn't know. If it contributed to ending apartheid, potentially you can reconcile the challenges of bringing in weapons with the positive end. But it's something that I think I struggle with, the idea of adding in violence. But I'm not sure exactly where I would fall on that, but it's a complicated thing and I don't think there's really any correct answer.
Well, thank you. And speaking of the complication, Neil, what do you think about whether or not the operation to smuggle weapons in under the seats of tourists was ethical or not?
I think if those 2 points are sort of very, very valid. And I think if you sort of go back and sort of reverse argue, and then you kind of come to this point where it's well, what were the alternatives to them to that operation? Certainly, there was a lot of violence, a lot of civilians did die. And I think the other thing that's important to remember is that before the ANC embarked on the armed struggle, there were a lot of discussions about whether this was the right thing. It wasn't something that they just thought, they wanted to do it because they were trigger happy. There were serious discussions about what this would mean about going on an armed struggle.
Well, that's an interesting point. If we can cover that a little bit. So for those who don't follow South African history as much as perhaps all of us do, so Chief Albert Luthuli won the Nobel Prize and was the first African to win the Nobel Prize for his stance, particularly his nonviolent stance. When Nelson Mandela was the head of the Youth League for the ANC, he ended up saying exactly your point, which is that nothing's happening, the South African regime is still in power, we have to have a dual-track operation in terms of trying to achieve peace and trying to force the government to do something, which was the stance where he now had to, according to Nelson Mandela, to embark on the armed struggle as well, which I take it was your point.
That's right. I think because President Luthuli had received the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think there were some concerns about how it would look, that he's the leader of an organization that's embarking on an armed struggle, and he's just received this important accolade for his non-violent efforts.
Well, let's get back to many years later. So now here we are, many years later, looking back at the operation as to how apartheid ended, and it's a fair debate as to whether or not MK really had a significant impact. Some people claim that it did, some people claim that it didn't.
In a sense, we're still learning the story about MK, and the sense that these stories are actually still coming out, and historians are still uncovering the true extent of MK's organisation within the country, I think is a really important thing to point out. The kind of long-standing view has been that actually MK provided a kind of armed propaganda, but that in actual fact it never had any realistic hope of invading the country, and that in a sense part of what it was doing was keeping alive the name of the ANC within the country. I think the ending of apartheid is such a complicated historical phenomenon that there's never going to have been a single cause.
Fair enough. In terms of the ethics, Peter, you raised the issue of the ethics, which is a fair question. So the ANC held itself out as a movement that was non-racial and an ethical movement. How do you square MK's existence within the ANC?
It's a very difficult dichotomy to struggle with. And I think the only reasonable way to address that for me as a student of history is that violence is sometimes a very necessary part of liberation. And even though the ANC is or tried to be a champion of efficacy and non-violence, they still helped perpetrate violence through MK, through supporting MK, and through directing some of MK's operations.
And Imogen, you're the only one here who I understand had a relative who's very specifically involved in this. Was it your dad who was involved?
Yes, my father became involved in the ANC, I believe, whilst he was at university. It wasn't something he spoke a lot about, because my understanding is that I think he was involved in MK, because he was definitely involved in some forms of like violent action. So yes, it was something that like I definitely grew up hearing about, and for him, he definitely felt that it was needed to be involved in action that caused like an effect and had an impact. He was very young when he joined. He was 16, I think, and he was involved in a very small cell that was involved in things like action on trains and train stations, but something that he really didn't spend a lot of time telling us about, because obviously you don't necessarily want to tell your children much about the fact that potentially you're responsible for people's deaths. So I think it was something that he struggled with afterwards, and at the time felt it was very, very important to be involved in that struggle, in helping make those changes. But I think it was something that afterwards he struggled with his involvement to a certain extent. He also did spend time in solitary confinement within like the army prisons for the work that he was doing, because he had to do compulsory military service. And at one point he was threatened with being forcibly lobotomized because of his views, which he was, I think, very outspoken about. But the impact on his family at the time, his family's phones were tapped, and the constant threat of danger from the government, I think, made his life very challenging, to the point that he had to come here as a political refugee when he was 22 or 23. And so I think it is, do we have that responsibility to do things that we might feel are ethically against what we believe in, morally go against our morals, when they can make a massive change or have the potential to cause positive benefits in the future? But they can really weigh on you personally when you make those calls and when you make those decisions, particularly when you make them at such a young age. And I think that was the thing that he really struggled with.
For your dad, or I should say as the daughter of your dad, was the line attacking a train when there were passengers versus the infrastructure?
I think it was, the idea was to attack the infrastructure. And obviously I'm not 100% certain on what happened. But I think, for me, I don't think I would have been able to have made the same decisions that he made. I think you always want to feel like you would have done something to support the ANC, but I don't think I'd have been able to become involved in something that was violent. That's probably my personal boundary, but my dad's choices were different, and obviously he was living in that regime. And yeah, I think it's really difficult sometimes to reconcile those things. And I think particularly like in the current climate where, I'm the daughter of a political refugee who in some ways could be viewed as a terrorist, but, no one would ever think of me or my father in that way. And I find it a really difficult thing to think about nowadays when you see lots of cases when people can't come here as political refugees. My father was able to, but potentially, he was doing things that were wrong. And I think it is something that, I very much respect what he did, but I don't think I would have made the same decisions myself.
So how do we balance the greater good versus the individual?
I think if you look at the like the amount of people that you could be looking, your decisions could be looking to benefit. That would be my view on that.
And since Imogen, you raised this issue, what do you think about that a little bit more?
I think it's something it's really hard sometimes to make the calls, and when something's detrimental to the individual, is it still beneficial to do it? I think you see it particularly during the ANC's armed struggle. You know, so many people died, and were their deaths something that, you know, did ultimately cause a change? And I think, yes, I think the greater good sometimes is worth fighting for, even at personal risk to yourself. And I think the people who can make those decisions and who choose to do that are admirable, because not every one of us would be able to put the greater good as more important than ourselves. And I think obviously it's a situational thing. You can't make a call, a general call. It's always going to be something that each individual needs to consider. But I do think if no one ever thought of the greater good, we wouldn't really get anywhere.
And on a personal level, Imogen, you just shared something quite personal for a television audience. Can I ask you, not that this is a psychological show, how do you feel about discussing this so personally?
I think it's something that, you know, for me, my dad is someone who I admired for what he chose to do. I wouldn't have maybe made those same decisions myself, but, you know, I think there's so many people who were involved in the ANC, who were involved in these struggles, whose stories aren't told. And I do think it is that element of hearing about people's personal stories. I did some work in my second year at university on forced removals, and looking at that and listening, and I read a lot of oral histories. And reading people's personal stories often enables you to feel more connected to something. And I think I always grew up around a lot of discussion of politics. My mother's father had been involved even earlier in South African politics. And so I think for me it was something that, you know, sharing these stories is a way of educating people on the sacrifices that others have made. It's a way of creating connection with people. I mean, when someone hears me speak, they don't necessarily think that I'm going to have that connection to South Africa. And I think it's the idea that it's people just like us who were involved in these things sometimes makes people feel more connected and more able to understand what was going on.
Fair enough. And Neil, why don't we give you the final word, since you're the postgraduate student here?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a shame that, you know, didn't get to meet your dad. You know, I would, you know, obviously I'm kind of coming from the point of view that, you know, I come from a mixed race family, so politically we were very much anti-apartheid. But I think it does kind of, in terms of the how ethical the operation was, it does kind of come down to which side of the fence you were standing on. But obviously in those days it was very hard to justify apartheid. You know, I think very few people could really stand up and say, you know, this is a good thing. I think even governments that kind of supported South Africa, like Britain and America, I think it was more for strategic purposes as opposed to, you know, they supported apartheid. You know, behind the scenes, they were all working towards, you know, releasing Mandela.
My name's Stuart Round. I was one of the first Africa Hinterland safari drivers, and I continued to drive the safaris on and off over a period of about 5 years. I think the first thing I'd like to point out is that anyone who was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle is a person who cares about human rights. At its core, the anti-apartheid struggle was a struggle for human rights. As far as the passengers were concerned, you know, these were people we spent a lot of time with. We were with them 24/7 throughout the duration of their trip. We built friendships, some of which lasted for years, some of which still last up to the present day. We didn't take their rights lightly. We cared for their welfare and their well-being and their safety. Obviously, there were certain risks involved for them that they weren't aware of and never gave their consent to. But I think to put that into some context, going on safari is an inherently risky endeavour. There are all sorts of risks involved, and the ones that came as a result of what we were doing were relatively small, I think, in the overall scheme of things. The sort of risks were, what if we'd had an accident? Would the truck have exploded? Well, no. If there had been a fire and it was a diesel truck, so even that's unlikely, it could have burnt for a long time. It probably would have burnt with more intensity, but everything was packed in a way that was safe and secure for transportation. The other big risk, of course, would have been passing through the border. What if we'd been caught? Would the passengers have been arrested? Would they have been sent to prison? I actually think that's extremely unlikely. I think it was would have been quite obvious to the South African security forces that all of our passengers were unaware of what was happening. I think it would have been quite unfeasible and unrealistic to expect that we could recruit 15 to 18 people for every trip who were well aware of what we were doing, and then for those people to continue into the wider world with that knowledge, hoping that they would never talk about it and compromise the security of our operation. That was just not a practical way of going about things. It's very easy, or easier, I think, to put oneself in the position of a tourist on a truck, travelling through Africa, going into South Africa, and then finding out years later that they were part of something more than that and exposed to a small amount of risk. It's perhaps more difficult to put oneself in the position of a black South African born in South Africa during the apartheid regime, who had most of their human rights removed. They had no right to vote. They never gave their consent to being governed under an apartheid regime. They had no legitimate means of protesting against that regime. There were no legitimate means of removing that regime and replacing it with something else. The people who did stand up and fight against the system faced enormous risks themselves. They could be arrested, they could be tortured, they could be imprisoned without trial, they could be imprisoned without trial indefinitely. Some of the people were tortured to death, others were simply thrown out of windows. People born under apartheid couldn't choose where they lived. There were segregated areas depending on your race. You couldn't choose what job you did. And when it came to education, for every 7 rand spent on the education of a white child, only 1 rand was spent on the education of a black child. So when we look at the damage that apartheid did, there were the obvious things, the poverty, the brutal oppression, the killings. But the hidden cost really was the massive loss of human potential of millions of people. And that to me is the largest tragedy. So if I were to compare the possibility of a relatively minor inconvenience for some tourists going into South Africa against the human rights of 35 million people living under an oppressive, racist system, there really is no question to be answered in my mind.
Thank you to all our guests for sharing your perspectives on Africa Hinterland, the human shield operation that took place towards the end of the apartheid era. The use of human shields continues to this day to be incredibly controversial. Many people argue that the use of human shields is a human rights violation. Other people contend that it's a human rights activity. Wherever you stand, I would please urge you to write in to us at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you again for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters involving today's college and university students. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.